Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I will. So someone said I'm an American, so I'm supposed to start with a joke. But in Japan, you're supposed to start with an apology. And so I will say, I apologize that I do not have a joke. All right. So anyway, I'm delighted to have you all here. It's a very interesting topic. So, and I'd like to maximize my chance to have a conversation with all of you. So, I mean, we could do a lot of things about how things are very important, but I want to focus on one real aspect of the paper, which is one aspect of the problem with digital platforms. And by the way, if I speak too fast, honestly, and I know Japanese will never say this, but please do tell me if I do. My American students complain that I talk too fast. And so if I talk too fast for them, I certainly probably will talk too fast for a non-native speaking audience. But please, if you don't understand what I'm saying, there's no point to the seminar. So please, if you don't have trouble understanding me, please say so. And I'm happy to stop, repeat, discuss, clarify. I'd much rather have this be a conversation than a very formal event, especially with a group so small. Okay. So we all know data is important, but many people, I will tell you, so the most sort of argumentative way I can say this is I hate the term big data because it encourages us to think of all data as being the same, and the only thing that matters is how much of it you have. I think this is a gross simplification that harms analysis. And phrases are either good because they promote insight or they're bad if they obscure important differences. I think big data obscures important differences and causes us to lump all different types of data together, regardless of the nature of the data, regardless of the business model, in ways that cause us to make basic mistakes. So my basic argument is we need a more nuanced, granular understanding of data if competition law is going to handle platforms effectively. And so if you want to know the framing of it. And so in terms of talking about this, it's okay. So one of the things that's quite interesting to me is many of the national competition authorities, antitrust enforcement officials, sorry, I should spell out all my abbreviations, but I didn't do this one, are actually being asked to think about data. It happens in a merger context. For example, most saliently in the US, in the FTC's case against Facebook, they did the analysis at the product level about when they acquired Instagram and WhatsApp. And they said Instagram is a photo sharing app, not a social media app. Well, first, our concept of what social media has changed, and we now perceive photo sharing as social media. But more importantly, people would say they needed to analyze not how much data they could acquire. And to jump ahead a little bit, the reason that's important, I think that there's actually an interesting argument there, is I actually do not think of most social media companies as social media. Their primary product is not social media. The primary product is advertising, because that's the revenue generating side. And it is, in fact, properly speaking, a two-sided market. One side is unpriced, which is the consumer side, and the price side is the advertising side. And so what's interesting to me when they're asking us is when you look at data is important, not so important for the social media side, or somewhat important, but for the advertising side, combining Instagram and Facebook could have major implications for advertising. And so what they're saying is we need to think about data as a separate market, not as a finished goods market, which we would analyze under conventional antitrust if they merged. But they're saying as an input to some other product, in this case, advertising, maybe that should be thought of independently. This is also coming up in the Google case, that's the trial that's going on right now in the United States. And the biggest argument, one of the central issues in the case is right now, Google participates in auctions done by every major browser to be the default search engine for the browser. So this happens it doesn't happen for Chrome and Edge, because for Chrome, Google is its own default search engine, and for Edge, Microsoft Bing is the default search engine. But for primarily Apple, for Mozilla, for all the smaller browsers, Opera, and so on and so forth, they have an auction to say, who will pay us the most money to be the default search engine for our browser? And one of the central allegations of the Justice Department's case against Google is based in data. They say by being the default search engine, they get more data from search queries, which improves their search results and makes it impossible for competitive search engines to compete effectively. So they take their dominant position, the money they make, to buy preferential placement on the search engine, on the default search engine on the browser. And the idea that access to greater data, larger amounts of data, makes them a better product and makes it impossible for people to compete with them. So there's a lot of criticisms I could make of this particular argument beyond the data argument. For example, one of the interesting facts that's come up is apparently when Windows 10 is shipped, it ships with Bing as this default search engine. So this argument only works if people do not change the defaults, or if what we say in English, defaults are sticky. Because you go out as the default engine, you simply use that. 90% of users change the default search engine in Windows from Bing to Google. And so this, to me, you can't just look at the argument at face value. You have to look at consumer behavior and understand what's going on. I mean, for example, we were talking about one of the things, the Android case. People say people don't switch from Android to Apple. To me, that's an empirical question. And, it's terrible. We all do these very casual empirics. My son has switched twice. And that's not proof, but it does raise the plausibility in my head, and we should look at more concrete forms of data. And there's all these wonderful questions we can get into this, which is, if Google's really a monopoly, why do they have to pay Apple so much money? Second, that auction is only for 3 years. If you have a contract that's up for renewal every 3 years, we know from the work of Harold Demsetz, you can achieve an outcome that looks very close to competitive outcomes, because you're auctioning off temporary monopolies, basically exclusivity it's not even exclusivity, it's preferential treatment. And there's all these different arguments which we could get into to see if that's valid, that are independent of the data argument. But let's just talk primarily today. It's motivated today about the data. Does having more data actually give you a competitive advantage? And in that case, does it become something where the large players have an advantage that they can use to perpetuate or even increase their advantage in the future? That's the core of the issue. Right. So I actually think that this is really ultimately an empirical question, which is we can make a theoretical argument. So it's sort of, if you want to know, all of us have an autobiographical story as scholars. All my work initially was theoretical. And it's what I realized is that if it's a theory, it's in the form of, when we think back to when we studied geometry back in high school or middle school, it gives you a theorem that says if P, then Q. And it goes from certain assumptions and you get certain conclusions from them. But first, if the assumptions aren't true, the theorem is irrelevant. Because if the conditions aren't met, if P is not met, then it tells you nothing. Second, it is a theoretical connection between P and Q, the input and the output, that has to be validated. Because all theorems, all models are reduced form approximations of reality. They're saying of this very complex reality, here are 5 factors that matter. And that may or may not be a good reduction of what's going on. It could be there's a critical 6th factor, and you don't know until you actually test it empirically. And one of the more interesting things to me I've learned is you have to constantly retest it. So in the US, they have an app, a website called Zillow, that estimates home prices. So if you wanted to know how much is my house worth today, well, you can use it to search for houses. But it will estimate, I can look at right now, they'll tell me what's the value of my house based on sales in the area. Well, Zillow was saw that they could actually identify houses that were underpriced based on their algorithm. So they began buying those houses. They believed in their algorithm. They made a lot of money until they lost a lot of money. The problem they have there is mostly is COVID. And I don't know what happens in Japan, but in COVID, we had a huge real estate prices went way up. Why? demand was very high, particularly in areas out of the city, because people wanted to move out of the city. The supply was down by 2/3 because no one wanted to move. And so they had trained their data and developed a model on relevant factors based on historical numbers, which were extremely valid pre-COVID. But in COVID, everything changed. And this is the nature of predictive analytics. They're only as good as the data you train them on. You see this, for example, with hedge funds. They often make a lot of money, but then they've been trained on data with market conditions that only look so. And my mother started investing in 1973, before one of the big market corrections. The stock markets lost half their value over 2 years. And through 2008, she saw all these young people on the market. She says they've never seen a down market. And they had this huge optimism. And I don't know how aware you are, the Great Recession of 2008, again, the market lost half its value. And it's one of these things where if you train on data from 1976 to 2007, you'd be very optimistic. And you need to have a full range of data, and you have to understand the validity of a model. All models, there's no model that's good for everything. They have to be fit for purpose, because we're reducing it to a limited number of considerations, which is a proper reduction most of the time, but sometimes it's not. And understanding this requires a degree of empirical validation. And I've come sort of full circle. I actually think there's still an important role for theory, and I'm struggling with that. We can talk about that later or over lunch. But if you think about the empirics that are necessary here, first to me is you have to analyze it, not data in the abstract, but in the context of a specific business model. The idea that the data needs for search and social media and e-commerce and streaming media would be exactly the same would be the most remarkable coincidence in the history of the world, which is the amount of data you need to make a good search engine has got to be very different from what you need to make a good e-commerce recommendation. Certainly less so perhaps on the advertising side, we'll talk about that, but it's really interesting to me. You have to understand it in the context of a specific business model. And I'll give you some specific examples. Second, there are different dimensions to data aside from just its size. That in fact, they talk often about how new it is, how varied the sources of the data are, that you can't just look at, they've got this much data and they've got this much data and compare them and get a valid understanding of what's going on. Third, there's always diminishing marginal returns to everything, including data. And understanding the structure of that diminishment becomes critical to understanding it. Otherwise, if you assume there's constant returns to scale, everything bigger is always better, you're assuming a monopoly. And in fact, that means everything, the scale economies are infinite and all this. And then the monopoly is an artifact of the assumptions of your model, not reality. And so we have to understand that better. And then lastly, data is only one part of the picture. In order to create an algorithm, you have to combine it with data science. And to understand that connection becomes important to really assess whether having more data or less is actually going to lead to anti-competitive outcomes. All right, let's take these one at a time. So business models dependency. I actually think that one of the most interesting things is you'll find in the literature discussions about how different models, how much data they require. So the fact that leaps out at me right now is if you look at just qualitatively, Amazon has a search engine designed to drive e-commerce. So when you look for something, it is basically looking at your past purchasing behavior to make a recommendation of something else you might want to buy. Google is looking at your past search behavior, saying if you're looking for these words, what else are you likely to be looking for? The idea that the amount of data you need to make a purchase recommendation and a search recommendation is likely to be quite different. And in fact, what you're going to see, and I think I have this on a different slide, I didn't print them out, what Hal Varian, the chief economist of Google, says, they construct their search queries on a sample of the overall search database they have, and it's 0.1% of their total data. So 0.0001. That's relatively small. And so the idea that there's huge scale economies in search that say Bing can't reach is unlikely for most of the search. Now we'll have to get, if there's rare searches, you need more scale. There's other things. So not all searches are uniform, and that's part of the analysis we need to do to understand how important these smaller, more less frequently occurring searches are for the revenue and to make that understood. But we have to really figure out, in fact, in the context of a specific business model, how much scale do you actually need? Now, what's interesting is we'll talk about this more. As I said, Google, I said before, Facebook is not a social media company. They are paid customers advertising, and their audience is social media. And so it's our social media customers. So when I tell my students, it's to show my age, the very first paper I wrote was about broadcast television at a time where that was the only kind of television there was. It's entirely advertising supported. And so when you look at the antitrust cases against broadcast television, it's hard to make a case that consumers are being harmed because they're paying zero. So the idea of alleging consumer harm, very hard to do. What they did is they brought monopsony power cases on the advertising side, which is they may be a purchasing oligopoly in advertising. In addition, they brought oligopsony cases on behalf of the movie studios. So they show content to attract audiences and then sell the audiences to advertisers. At the same time, they're the main purchasers of video content. And there was a question about an oligopsony purchase on that side. So if we think about these scale economies, you'd have to think not just are there scale economies in search, but are there scale economies in terms of the advertising production and the scale economies in terms of the content acquisition that they do. And what we will discover is, I will say, and I'll get to this in more when I talk about the difference between structured and unstructured data, the economies of scale are much more significant on the advertising side. But there's a difference there with opportunities for supply substitution, that is alternative sources of data. But we'll talk about them when we get to a different slide. But the point I'm making is, in a two-sided market, you actually have to analyze the different scale on each side of the market as well. So search has, because it has two components, has two different types of scale economies, which are likely to be very different. And so to understand the market, you have to look at them both. Okay, so getting into the guts of this, there is a trade-off, traditionally, really to me, epitomized by Oliver Williamson's classic efficiencies defense, which is you can, by achieving greater scale, an improving pressure on consumer welfare if there's still unrealized scale economies. That is, if you can get big, his classic model, if you get bigger in scale and you're still declining in average costs, you actually can make it cheaper, which increases the available surplus. At the same time, by the diminishing that allows you to have multiple providers. So what you have usually, though, is scale economies eventually get exhausted. That is, nothing gets cheaper forever. And that eventually it starts to curve back up, and eventually you have an area which we call minimum efficient scale. And that's the volume a producer needs to be cost competitive with its rivals. So the key question is, there enough demand in the total market to allow multiple providers to exist, achieve minimum efficient scale in the market? So if the minimum efficient scale is, let's give it a number, is 100 units, and the total market is 1,000 units for every period, then you'd expect at least 10 firms to be able to survive at cost effectiveness, and we have no competition problem. And this is what we call the classic problem. The definition of a natural monopoly is what we call sub-additivity, is where one producer can produce it cheaper than two producers could. And so the catch is here, if minimum efficient scale is more than half the size of the market, you end up with a natural monopoly. And that's just inevitable. So the big question is, where is minimum efficient scale? Where do the diminishing marginal returns of scale end? And we start to see the upward swing in the average cost or diminishing benefits here. And so the problem I have is most models posit inexhaustible returns to scale in data. Now, we saw this in the old network effects literature, where they basically assume not only that it goes up, but it goes up quadratically. Now, and as the person who pioneered this is all based on a law that was written by Gordon Moore, who invented the Ethernet. No, I'm not Moore. Metcalf, who invented the Ethernet. Robert Metcalf. He actually thought that the value would go up with the number of endpoints, the amount of data, quadratically. And if that's the case, then anything that goes up quadratically will always dominate. It's going up very fast. And he said nothing goes up quadratically forever. If you're looking for things that go up quadratically, we call those pyramid schemes. They're illegal because they're unsustainable. And so we have to understand that nothing behaves like that. So we actually have to understand really what the scale economies are, where the minimum efficient scale is, where that flattens out to the point where getting more data really is no benefit, to understand what the natural structure of this market is, to see how it's going to play out. So as I mentioned before about Hal Varian, he says the structure on the search side is very, very small. And granted, Hal now works for Google. One of the more interesting papers I've seen is one by Leslie Chew and at Occidental and Catherine Tucker at MIT, where they actually took advantage of a natural experiment where they had a change in data storage policies, I think imposed by law. So it's an exogenous change, very natural. And when I say you need statistics to understand these sorts of studies, I actually think it's really helpful, where Bing and Yahoo went and reduced the amount of data they were storing to satisfy search queries. Now, if we believe there were large-scale economies in search, we would expect, after this change imposed by law, the quality of the searches under Bing and Yahoo to decline dramatically. They didn't. And in fact, you have to get the way this works, you have to get a measure of how do you measure search quality. The thing that their measure was how often the same consumer ran the same search a second time. If you have to repeat a search, it's a pretty good example. You didn't get the result you're looking for. And what they found is that the tendency to rerun the same search more than once did not increase, even after Yahoo and Bing radically cut back on the amount of data, which they found is suggesting that the scale economies in data and search are confirming that they really tend to be rather small. And so that's a really interesting claim. What's interesting is on the advertising side, it gets a little more complicated. As I mentioned, in advertising, we actually can benefit from more data, and I'll talk more about this when we get to structured versus unstructured. But again, Catherine Tucker is the same scholar here in the middle name, but they actually looked at data brokers who actually are third-party sources of data, which is really interesting too, by the way, because if there's sufficient data brokers, the idea that a single company has proprietary data shouldn't matter, because you have availability of advertising data profiles from other sources. And one of the things they did is they looked at that to see how effective they were at generating the type of information that advertisers need. Advertisers want to know your age, your gender, how much you earn. Are you interested in travel? Are you interested in sports? Are you interested in your different things? And what they discovered that the data broker profiles varied in terms of quality. Some were better for sports and fitness and travel interest than age and gender. But here's the really interesting thing is by adding in data and optimization, it dramatically improves the quality of this information. And so what we're discovering, this is an area where data analytics seem to matter a lot. And she, in a separate speech, a separate paper interpreting this data, compared of the three data brokers, he looked at the amount of data each one had. And she found that the data broker with the most amount of data did not perform better than the ones with less data. So again, she took this as confirming the idea that the scale economies in data on the advertising side were exhausted within the size of the data that they had. Certainly the second largest firm had. And so this is the way we start to get traction empirically around how significant these scale economies are, which we need to know in order to decide what the minimum efficient scale is and decide whether we see a single firm emerge. Is it because there's an inherent market failure from scale economies in the market, or is it possibly because the firm is performing better? We had mentioned before about the comparison shopping case. One of the most interesting things that all big tech companies do is they do what we call A/B testing, which is when they deploy a new change to their algorithm, they don't just deploy it, they randomly assign it to 50%. And they compare the two to see which one people like better. And what the measure for them of which one people like better was click-through. And one of the things the reason the US in 2014 did not bring the comparison shopping case when the EU did is they looked at two things. One is what did the click-through data say about what consumers like better? And the click-through data said customers click through more on the comparison shopping deployment, which tells you that they were actually meeting consumer demand for services more, and that in fact what you saw, the reason they were performing better was not necessarily they created a better product that appealed more to consumers, and so that's competition on the merits. The second thing they looked at is if did Bing imitate them? Because if this is really bad for consumers, Bing should stick to its original process, and then they can use this to win customers if customers don't like it. And what they discovered is Bing switched to the same presentation that Google did. And so, and there's nothing to stop them. It's not a durable competitive advantage anyway, because the competition can switch to it as well. But we're looking for consumer-based indicia to try to understand which is better. And in fact, here what we're again seeing is we're trying to find those sorts of filters that separate conduct that is theoretically ambiguous. It could be competitive, pro-competitive, it could be anti-competitive. And we need these sort of empirical filters to decide, a test to decide which is the case. Because otherwise we risk penalizing behavior that is actually competition on the merits, which from an innovation standpoint would be disastrous, because that's exactly the kind of behavior we're trying to encourage. All right. So there's some other stuff on e-commerce that's pretty interesting. Pat Bajari, who's the chief economist for Amazon, so I have to be a little careful here, but he was looking at how long a product was available, how did that affect the search results? That's, again, the quantity of data. But he studied something pretty interesting, which is how many other similar products are you selling? This isn't economy of scale. This is what we call economy of scope. That is, if you have more similar products, do your search results improve? And what they discovered is that the amount of data did show some economies of scale, but they were decaying pretty rapidly. And so they were speculating, they can have some estimate out when they thought they would be exhausted. And as you know, if they're going down like this, many times they never go completely to zero or turning up again. But at some point, the question is, are they flat enough that there really is, it's like 1 over x goes like this, as close to zero. At some point, yes, it's not zero, but it's so trivially different from zero, it can't yield a competitive advantage. But what's interesting is he found that economies of scope didn't apply. And so having a lot of the same product didn't actually benefit their search results. And so they were actually trying to figure out what they're playing with models and technology, which is something else I'll talk about. But we're starting to see an empirical literature rise measuring exactly how these things are, whether they're true. And one of my biggest problems with the way the EU is litigating cases is they're not actually doing the kind of traditional econometric analysis we associate with competition law. They're accepting testimony about effects and looking at effects on consumers, on competitors, which violates our number one principle of competition law, which is it's supposed to benefit consumers, not competitors. And so harm to it's very consistent with the move sort of towards ordoliberalism and competitive processes, but it's very inconsistent with the focus in US law, in recent EU law, and other places on effects. Because it's too easy to count just the number of providers and try to understand it, because in some markets, fewer providers actually yields is better for consumers. Right. Then, just in summary, we do find these diminishing marginal returns in scale and some of the literature and scope. We need more empirical work. The famous line is, "Don't believe a paper, believe a literature," because there's just one paper is often that can be wrong. It's not wrong to be one data set sample of a data set, may be biased. We don't know. We have to be very careful about that. But we really need to understand this a lot better and understand not just across business models, but it's likely to have different demographic impacts and in different aspects, which we can start chopping finer and finer so we can understand these better. All right. So let's talk about the multidimensionality of data. So one of the really interesting things to me is they ask, sometimes about whether it's inimitable, rare, valuable, and non-substitutable. In the lay literature, they talk about 3 V's. One is volume. That's what we think about the total size. But they're saying there's more to it. A velocity, that is how new it is. And the last one is variety. How many data sources you get it from. And it's interesting, even that's kind of, to me, even this is data model dependent. So things such as search queries probably have to be pretty current. But if you try to develop an advertising profile to try to identify your gender and your age and your interests, well, our genders for most of us do not change. And so even old data would be pretty good. And if you want gender data, You think about it, financial institutions have a lot of data about us, telephone companies have a lot of data about us, a lot of different actors do, and they sell it. And so there's a lot of different ways you can think about this. So velocity is not an inherent good that's always equally valuable. A lot of it depends on what you want to use it for. Just so you know, I found this pop literature that finds other V's. The most funniest one that has found 42 different V's. And again, this is a good example about why you model. A model that focuses on 42 factors is essentially useless because you can't, it doesn't predict anything and you don't get enough variation where if 30 things vary at the same time, what are you supposed to do? I mean, it's just very, very hard to draw implications from this. But but they all reflect an idea that there's more to data than just its size, and that this is something that we need to start taking into account. But there's not very much academic literature. So this is sort of an interesting idea. But there is an academic literature on a different thing, which is there's data scientists will tell you there's a basic distinction between what we call structured and unstructured data. So structured data is what we most of the time think of as a traditional database. First, it'll be like the U.S. Census. They have my household, my zip code, the number of people in my household, perhaps our ages and our genders, estimate of our income. They have all this information collected for this, and then for each other household, they have the same row. And in general, structured data is not just this. It's collected with a particular model in mind. So when we have an algorithm which has inputs A, B, C, and D, you then collect a database with rows of each individual, but columns A, B, C, and D, and you're collecting that data specifically with that model in mind. And what I'll tell you, this is how we do search. They actually know if someone's looking for these words, how often did they look for what predictably, just in terms of the data, what were the other searches they would tend to be looking for? And that's how they make these suggestions, these different things. And it's really motivated by a very specific model. And to jump ahead to what I'm going to tell you, the scale economies in this stuff is very, very low because it's so orderly. Unstructured data is completely different. It's like giving you every photograph that everyone's ever taken and all the content for their email or their social media posts, and extract from this what we call feature extraction, learn something from it, and don't create your own categories. Figure out what categories are relevant and let it emerge. And this is not motivated by a particular model. You just get data that was collected randomly. And if you look at, for example, at ChatGPT, the different generations of this were trained on Reddit posts or Wikipedia posts or different things where these were not written for language recognition and the predictive analytics that we do right now for large language models, but they took from it and they didn't just look at work, they extracted features from it, and now we get generative AI. And this is a completely different function. So what we'll discover is the scale economy. Well, first, you have to understand that total data is nonsensical because structured data and unstructured data can't be combined. There's no meaningful way to say, oh, look at the total amount of data you have. If part of it's structured and part of it's unstructured, this is a ridiculous comparison. You learn nothing by the total amount of data. But second is the structured data. The structured data, you exhaust the scale economies very, very quickly. And I want to leave some time, so I'm not going to go through all the details. Unstructured data actually has huge scale economies. The solution when you don't get answers is to throw more data at it. And they have these things called initially data lakes and now data oceans, where you just train it against that. And so part of it is understanding what kind of data you're using to motivate your model is critical to understanding where the scale economies are, because they're going to be much larger for structured data than for unstructured data. And the structured data has been used for advertising. Historically, we've had a nice split, which is on the consumer-facing side, the search side, it was structured, very small scale economies. On the unstructured side, it's very large scale economies. But I have this on another slide, but my mind's just going in circles, and I did this on the plane. So, I mean, it's just, that's breaking down. One of the things we're learning in the Google search case, the Google case right now, is that, in fact, Bing is making the biggest improvements it's ever made in search in just the last few months. Why? It's incorporating AI into answering search results. And so search fulfillment is no longer a matter of just looking at search data. It's combining it with AI data. Now, remember what I told you before. AI is trained on publicly available data. So the idea of proprietary data creating this feedback loop maybe was true a year ago, maybe was not, but on a going forward basis, and when it's all AI driven, almost certainly is not true. Because now you're dependent on actually getting access to AI, and AI needs access to these large public data sets, which are open to anybody. Complicated question in the US about whether it's truly open to anybody, but that's a whole different question about data security law. Anyway, but what we're starting to see is these enormous improvements. And there's a question right now whether unstructured data is now restricted to the advertising side. We're now going to see, I think, uses of unstructured data on the search fulfillment side and on the consumer facing side increasingly. And in that case, it's going to likely, I actually think Google might be in extremely big trouble right now. And I think that if you look at the documents they're writing, I think they know that. Because first, the search market was going away from them because in shifting to mobile, we don't search nearly as often on mobile as we did on landline. And second is we're going to see that search is no longer be driven by the way that it's been driven in the past. Okay, so so I don't think you can just look at the V's. You have to look at, you can't just look at the size. You have to look at the different aspects. You have to look at structured versus unstructured, and that's changing over time. All right. So the last point I'm going to make is it's interesting is many people said it's not just a matter of having data. You have to know what to do with it. And there's a lot of companies that have a lot of data that wish they could turn it into value. They can't. Because what you need is data scientists. And particularly, actually, I'll tell you, on the structured side, you don't. It's pretty simple. My student, I'm doing it. It's really easy. On the unstructured side, it's more art than science. And you need really, really good people to be able to do it and to make it work really, really well. And so what we're discovering is, that yes, data analytics are a big deal. A lot of firms have a lot of data, can't make any good use of it, and that they're really looking at how the data science works. And this is a study that I really like, which is they looked at this basically sets of algorithms. I think this is a large language model. And they tested them based on how much data they were given, and how quickly they improved. And what you see here is they all improve with scale. So they're getting better. But you'll see is they react very differently to the amount of data they have. So the red line there was outperforming everything on very small amounts of data, but is underperforming based on larger amounts of data. So understanding algorithm choice and the decision about how to design an algorithm is as much a determinant of how effective the performance is as the amount of data it has. If the algorithm didn't matter, there would be no red line. They'd all be clustered together like all the others are. What you start to see is some diffusion based on basically, this is the data science component. It's not just the data, it's what you do with it. And we're going to see that this becomes a critical component of it, that there's not just one, but there's two inputs that determine not just the data and its size, but the data science you have. The other one is there is another study by Zhang et al. That actually took did a tournament of 7 mature algorithms. And they put it against 12 different data sets and saw how they did. And what you'll see is there are very, very different data sets, some biomedical, social, physical, business, games, and the like. And they're looking at different predictions. What could it do better and what could it do worse? And what we saw is huge variance, which tells you it's not just about throwing more data at a problem. It's about choosing the right algorithm, learning, improving it in ways that are really, really important, and that there's actually a bunch of additional cost factors. Some algorithms consume more computer resources. It's not just this. What you'll find, the easy ones are quick and dirty and they run fast. The more complicated ones can take days. And so this becomes a factor in performance. That's not just a function of not only the science, in terms of the quality of the algorithm, but how costly they are to run. And so you end up seeing a much more complex thing that to me makes this more than just the size of the data, which tells you have to understand what problem you're using the data to solve, what algorithms you're using before we can start to understand the likely impact, because there's a tendency just to say it's bad. It's like this is the same argument that the one that actually just drives me crazy, and I've written about this, is people say, oh, there's network effects. This must lead to market failure. That's just not true. First, most of those models posit infinite network effects, but the reality is we have a lot of online models where travel sites are very competitive. And so you see, it's just not true that if something has network effects, it's going to be worse. And that we also see things like multi-homing, means it's no longer a winner-take-all market. You can actually be on multiple travel sites, you have multiple browsers at one time. The Microsoft case to me comes out completely differently now. I have three browsers on my computer. Most of us do. And so the idea that by distribute and I can get another browser in 20 seconds by clicking one button. And so it's just, it's just understanding how this all fits together to me becomes really important. This is just basically saying we have very few data scientists, many fewer than there is demand. And so the dear resource here is actually not data, it's the data scientists. And so what I would say is that, the quality of data science plays a key role, matters more for unstructured data. And that, in fact, you see the algorithms, they vary across domains of success. And so you have to know what domain you're going to use it for, because that's going to be very different depending on whether you're doing medicine versus you're doing, stock picking, and so forth. You have to know what to do with the data, and that it's extremely expensive to hire data scientists. I mean, one of the most remarkable things happening right now, for the first time in my lifetime, I have friends who are leaving the academy to go work for the companies because they can't do the cutting edge work from the academy, from the universities anymore. They have the companies have all the data, and their proprietary work is so far ahead of the academic work, and the only way to find out what they're doing is actually go join the companies. And that's a reality that we live in. And so, in fact, just looking at data is not that helpful. So I think the empirical relationship, what all this says is it's not just size. We have to actually understand different components of this, and we have to understand it with respect to different business models. We actually have to figure out break it down into different dimensions to understand how things are important, which may be maybe also business model dependent at the same time, so these interact. You need to find out how the diminishing returns kick in the minimum scale you need to be effective and compete. And what we see is really look at which this gets flattened and look at the alternative stuff. The other thing that's really interesting is really illustrated to me by the Google case. This is also going to change over time. As technology change, ChatGPT is changing everything, and we know it. And so the idea that you can just come to a conclusion and fix it over time is just not like, all right, that's a good place.